So I wanted to record about kind of the regionalized America because we're going to kind of run out of time to really talk about this. So this is kind of so we talked in class about kind of the reform movement. So I wanted to kind of give you a sense of how things like the market economy and reform are kind of shaping kind of different parts of the country. So this period really around 1840, as we're moving from 1840 towards 1860, is a period of one word for it is sectionalism, another word for it is regionalized. Really, what it means is that different parts of the country kind of have different core issues. And just kind of a quick reminder that, we had acquired the Louisiana Purchase. And so the Louisiana Purchase had expanded this opportunity. Now, one of the things we will be talking about next week is going to be the war with Mexico, and that will get the United States, kind of Texas and California, New Mexico, and all that kind of stuff. So as we're moving into 1840, as of that point, we don't have it. What you have is essentially kind of this map that you see here, and kind of gives you a little bit of an idea about how the country is developing. And you can kind of get a sense for where the treaty lines are, all that kind of stuff. Now, this is going to, again, once you get to the Mexican-American War, by the time you get to 1846, 47, 48, this map starts to look very, very different. But the regionalization, the sectionalism doesn't go away. In fact, the adding of territory only makes it worse. This particular map right here shows you the change in U.S. manufacturing. So you can kind of get a sense, if you look at kind of the map key, the difference of manufacturing employees by county. And you can see up in kind of the Northeast around Massachusetts, you have a lot, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, you have a lot of manufacturing employees, in that particular area. But even when you're talking about, other places in Pennsylvania or New York, you still have some manufacturing going on. So understand that this is what we mean when we talk about the market economy changing, and really kind of having this impact. And it clearly is having this impact in kind of the Northeast area, but it's shaping things in all the other places as well. And at the same time that you have, if you look at the map of kind of manufacturing and kind of where that is, and then you look at this map about cities and immigrants, there is a correlation there, right? So, you can definitely see that, based on employment manufacturing, and then you look at number of immigrants, the growth of cities, this is what you start to see happening, right? So just kind of keep in mind that for the North, cities, manufacturing, immigration are kind of driving factors for them. And of course, the immigration factor is going to be a big part of this, right? So they're going to struggle with kind of this question about immigration, particularly the Irish immigration, the Irish potato famine. And it's really going to raise a question about how America is defined. We'll be talking more about this notion of nativism, which is a preference for people born in this country, native-born people. And you start to see some of the same trends that we'll see later in the 1800s, like distinct ethnic neighborhoods, attempts to Americanize and assimilate people. So some of those trends we'll talk about again later. Just know that they're really kind of beginning in the 1830s. And of course, the Irish were particularly, they were looked down upon in part because of their Catholic faith. I think you have to be a little bit careful about comparing the Irish to people of color. That's not a real fair comparison because Irish could pass for being American if once they lost their accent. All it would take was a name change. So that's a very different experience than somebody whose skin is a different color. But you do have a lot of anti-Irish discrimination. And it just kind of depends from area to area, job to job, that kind of thing. So you just want to keep that in mind. And the North is very much defined by this market system. Urbanization is a big part of this, the growth of cities. Again, the factories are built so that cities grow up around them, especially as they move into immigrant labor. So the immigrants work close to where the factories are. This is going to make the cities very crowded. You will have a middle class. The middle class typically don't live in the center of town. They typically live kind of along the ring of town, if you will. And what you start to see in the cities is a clear wealth gap between the people that have plenty of money or the middle class and the people that are very poor. And the people that are poor, the working class, they're going to deal with a lot of social problems. And, this is where kind of those reform efforts come in. So that middle class that's very concerned about how the working poor are living are concerned about it because they see it, right? They're it's in their city, right? And that's part of what they're concerned about. And so you definitely see that this kind of goes hand in hand with reform. The other thing too that you see is kind of ethnic gangs, particularly with the Irish. And if you've ever watched the movie Gangs of New York, it kind of plays a little fast and loose with some historical aspects, but it does kind of depict, the Five Points area of New York, where you would have these kind of ethnic gangs between the Irish and Protestants and that sort of thing, native-born Americans, that kind of thing. As we're moving into the mid 1800s, you have increased rail networks, particularly in the north and the northeast. That's going to connect rural areas to the cities and kind of facilitate that transportation. So the north and the Midwest, those areas that have manufacturing, will have a lot more access, be a lot more transportation in a way that's very different than what you have in the South, right? The South is never going to have that level of transportation. This particular picture depicts kind of that Five Points area in a fight between various gangs. You have this middle class that kind of emerges, and I've already talked a little bit about kind of their reform impulses. But part of what happens too with the middle class is you start to have more leisure time. The middle classes can afford gas lighting. This allows them to read books. This allows them to go to minstrel shows. So the emergence of Jim Crow as a character comes from this period. The earliest professional sports come from this. And this is why things like Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to become so very popular during this period, or why going to the theater is going to become so very popular, is because the middle class are going to be able to enjoy, kind of distracting themselves from the problems of everyday life. Now, obviously, that's not going to work the same for the working class, because the working class are going to have to rely. I mean, if they get to go out and enjoy anything, they're going to the saloon to drink, which is, of course, where you start to see that kind of cross between the middle class reform interests and all that kind of stuff. So the saloon movement, and of course that's going to lead to the ethnic gangs. So you definitely have different kind of class structures as far as entertainment, but you do definitely, with the middle class, see the benefits of gaslighting, see the benefits of the extra money that they have, and that sort of thing. Now in the West, it's different because you don't quite have as many cities. You have a few cities, but not nearly as many. And you have a lot more people that are out west because they want to make money, or because they got tired of dealing with kind of social structures back in the East. And you really have kind of two stages of this. You've got one that happens early, where you're talking about, people that are just packing up and moving, that decide they can't make it in the East, or the economy has crashed, and so they're going to pack up and move to the West. And like you think about the Mormons that packed up to escape religious persecution. So you've got different groups of people that are kind of just moving on their own, right? That's where the earliest kind of wagon trains and settlement comes from. By the time you get to the second phase, Manifest Destiny, this is going to take place around 1840, 1850. This is right about the time of the Mexican-American War, so there is a direct correlation between the Mexican-American War and the existence of Manifest Destiny, and kind of that Manifest Destiny is going to kind of presume that the United States is entitled to all of that land. And it's very much tied up in kind of this idea that Anglo-Americans are the ones that need to control the country, that the U.S. is destined by God, right? It is a very difficult existence. I mean, people that move to the West do face, I mean, it does tend to create a unique kind of person. Your earliest kind of unique people would be those miners, those mountain men, but it also is going to include women and people that create farms, and even people that move into the immigrants that come into the country. So one of the pieces of immigration that we don't often talk about is the role of Chinese immigration, right? So Chinese immigration begins really by the time you get to the 1840s, and there's factors for this, namely that China is being exploited by various European powers. China is being very, the Chinese emperor is having lots of problems. There's lots of combination of factors that are going on there. But you do see increased interest of the Chinese in coming to the country, right? And so you have them coming in through California, and again, a lot of what they're doing is working in cities, doing manufacturing work, doing kind of whatever labor they can find. Once the gold mines are found, they become very active in kind of mining. And then later on, they will be significant in kind of building the Transcontinental Railroad. So one of the things that we tend to forget is the role of the Chinese in establishing our country. So as much as the Irish in many, many ways. But we don't often talk about them. And really, if you want to talk about immigrants that face discrimination, the Chinese face significant discrimination, even before they passed the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So lots of kind of realizations about kind of, how immigration plays a role. But regardless of who it is, what kind of person it is, you have people that are really in kind of a unique place, right? You don't have established government. There's a lot of make your own rules. So these are very unique kind of people, and it is a mentality, right? At least until you get to the 20th century. Now, I would argue that as we've moved into the 20th and then the 21st century, I don't know that. I mean, I suppose you could argue there's still a different mentality, but I'm not entirely sure that that's true. But certainly in the 1800s, when you don't have established government and you have people moving, and they're facing confrontations with Native Americans. And of course, as you have more and more people moving west, you have those Plains Indian tribes that had largely been able to kind of exist knowing that the Americans were out there. They're getting increasingly under pressure during this part. So, the development of trails, you've got lots of trails. The Mormons are part of that, the Oregon Trail, the California Trail. California becomes very attractive to Americans in the 1830s and 1840s. So you start to see more and more Americans getting over to California. Some of them doing overland trails, some of them sailing on ships, going all the way around the tip of South America to come from the East Coast to the West Coast. 6-month-long trip. It was a pretty daunting excursion. This will all become more significant when you get to the California Gold Rush, right? Now, you'll want to kind of keep this. Remember that around 1846, 1845, Texas Revolution, right? California will kind of undergo a similar kind of thing. Like California was a Mexican state, had probably a stronger, California culture than, say, the Tejano. I hesitate to say that. I'm not sure that I can say that definitively. But certainly the Californios, California had been established and more developed, I guess is the way to say. Remember that Texas was used largely as a buffer to the Comanches, right? So the Comanches and the Plains Indians had really kind of controlled huge swaths of Texas for a really long time. And that seems to be less the case in California, right? And so what happens in California is much more complicated because you have, the Californios not always treating the indigenous people very well. Then you'll have the Americans not treating the Californios very well. It's just kind of it's an interesting kind of melting pot, if you will. And so essentially Americans were coming in pretty frequently. And so what will happen is in 1846, you'll have Fremont try to declare, this is where you get them calling it the Bear Revolution. But pretty quickly, the United States, end of the Mexican-American War gives the United States California. So this kind of attempt at independence doesn't really kind of take hold. By 1848, you have the discovery of gold. Lots of people moving to the West, looking for that get rich quick kind of, think about Jamestown and what attracted people to the colonies. Well, now people are being attracted across the country to go dig for gold, eventually dig for silver, copper, tin, whatever metals they can find. And this is going to have some significant environmental impacts, right? If you ever want to understand the impact of kind of mining, you look at the city of Sacramento and kind of how Sacramento had to deal with the environmental impacts of the extensive mining in that area. And it leads really to a boom economy. Now, the boom economy is not really tied to finding gold. The boom economy is tied to providing the picks and the axes and the shovels and the materials that the gold miners need. But you still have lots of people coming in. And again, you have lots of Chinese immigration coming in. And so you'll really have on the West Coast kind of that anti-Chinese immigration attitude, just like on the East Coast, you have an anti-Irish kind of attitude. This painting actually comes, I think it's late 1800s, early 1900s. Is a depiction of manifest destiny, and really kind of, depicts, you have the light over here, the dark. Here's the Native Americans being driven out by mountain men and miners and families. And then you've got stagecoaches and farms and trains and telegraph wire and kind of this idea of kind of the never ending progress, right? And so this is how the West is really going to be shaped. They're going to have unique concerns that have to do in part with Native Americans, that have to do with Chinese immigration, that have to do with development of internal improvements and that sort of thing. You're also going to see that the West, they have some agricultural concerns, but they're not all tied up in agriculture, right? They tend to be, so that they're kind of a hybrid, right? They're unique from the North, they're unique from the South. But they definitely kind of have some overlapping concerns with those different areas. Now, if you're talking about the South, what you're looking at, this is a picture in 1840 that shows you where cotton production was. Of course, this, kind of makes sense. The area that Solomon Northup's at is right here, kind of in the middle of Louisiana. Of course, in 1840, Texas is independent still. And so, you do actually have cotton production going off into Texas. And this map right here from 1860 kind of shows you what's happening there as well, and kind of the prominence of cotton production throughout the South. So cotton is a key kind of export that we see happening. And then I love this particular map because this is wealth per white male by state, right? Look at where the wealth of the country. So here's the interesting thing. The North has factories and has manufacturing, but the wealth of the country is tied up in cotton production and in plantations and in slavery. Now, some of what this wealth is the ownership of human beings, right? Because human beings were just, given a value in 1860. So this isn't necessarily cash in the bank. I can drop down money, cash on hand, but this is definitely going to be a system by where you see people building their wealth on the ownership of slaves. So if you want to understand kind of why you have this separation between the North and the South, I think this particular map says it all. And it's pretty, fascinating to me to kind of consider the role of wealth there. So kind of a quick reminder, in the South, most did not own slaves. In fact, most people, only a very small percentage of people owned more than 20 slaves. Most are going to own less than 5. You will have a few like Epps that own 10 or so. But you definitely have kind of this gap between planters and between other people, between your smaller farmers. And so 12 Years a Slave does a really good job of kind of depicting that you have this very wealthy elite group. So when you talk about wealth per white male, that's actually going to be concentrated in the hands of a very few number of people. Now, part of the misunderstanding is people are, and those men do control politics. I think the North will mistake the fact that kind of your ordinary small planter, your Edwin Epps, that they won't be invested in the slave system, and they kind of assume that it's only these really rich guys. In reality, as we've seen in 12 Years a Slave, all whites in the South are somehow connected and invested in the system of slavery. Even if you're talking about somebody like Bass, who is somebody from Canada who's questioning slavery. Even somebody like him, until he meets Northup, was participating with the system of slavery even as he criticized it, right? So just kind of understand that this is part of the conundrum that is slavery, right? And again, very little manufacturing, no public education. And you do have some differences when you're talking about places like up here in Virginia. It looks a little bit different than if you're talking about, say, Alabama and Mississippi. But still, generally speaking, you have kind of this idea that the plantation economy has come in and taken over, right? So white society is dominated. If Northern society is dominated by kind of the owners of the factories and the middle class managers, and then the working class, and if the Western society is a little more kind of an opportunity for all people, right? So you might have native born versus immigrant, Californios versus American. It's kind of the idea in the West that everyone's just a millionaire that hasn't made money yet, right? But in the South, you definitely have kind of this social society that's ranked by land and slave ownership, right? And it's very difficult given the economic factors of the cotton industry, right? The boom and bust cycles. You typically, it's hard to get social mobility, and you see that with Epps, right? Now Epps is socially mobile. He does work his way up, but it is a long, slow process. And even by the time Northup leaves him, Epps, still only owns 9 slaves, which only, right? But in comparison with, say, Ford, who has generationally inherited some money, right? And you typically have these planters, the wealthy, the larger kind of plantation owners, the ones that own lots of slaves. They typically see themselves kind of paternalistically. They're going to kind of take care of things. They're going to stand up for the system. They're going to talk a lot of the rhetoric. But make no mistake, you have a lot of other Southerners who fall kind of within the yeoman or kind of the small planter kind of category, where they don't have 20 plus slaves, or they don't have as much acreage, but they do have a plantation. They have a few slaves, or they're farming themselves or something like that. And they are very focused on trying to keep things together. They want the aspiration and the opportunity of the planters. But they typically are more concerned with just trying to keep things going than they are with getting involved in politics. So it's kind of interesting if you kind of break it down that way, and you realize that the strength of the Confederacy and the support for slavery and white supremacy will come from that yeoman and even the landless whites. The planters will kind of direct that to some extent, but they couldn't do it all on their own. And one of the big misunderstandings that the North has is that they think that your average kind of small farmer, small plantation owner is somehow going to not be invested in the role of slavery, right? And so that's clearly not going to be true. And you have you have whites that are wage laborers, right? This is where kind of the racism comes in, and you definitely see this in if you're looking at the whole story of 12 Years a Slave. The other aspect of the South is going to be the life of the enslaved, right? And the question here is that there's a lot of misinformation, and what you have to understand is that slaves were an investment, right? And we definitely see this when you're talking about Epps, when you're talking about Ford, when you're talking about Tibbetts, right? That they do provide profit and investment. So you do tend to have most owners having some awareness that basic health, basic procreation are positives, right? But I don't want you to that too often the lost cause myth has used the idea that somehow this meant that everything was hunky dory, right? That enslaved people were treated humanely. And that is not true, right? And as we see in 12 Years a Slave, just because there is a legal standard that's technically supposed to protect somebody from murder doesn't mean that it legitimately protects them, right? When enslaved people can't testify, then there's a workaround, right? So that is one of the problems. And then you have this whole question of abuse and being beaten. The abuse of women, being having your family ripped apart. All of those are things that are horrific and awful and terrible. And so we want to be sure that we don't conflate the idea that wealth was held in human bodies, right? And therefore people had some awareness. I think I mentioned that, that Andrew Jackson, right, was known for keeping families together and that kind of thing. But that doesn't mean that he was treating people well because he believed they were people. It means that he was simply looking out for his own bottom line. So we want to be sure that we don't conflate this kind of protecting of an investment with the idea that somehow that meant they were treated well or that their life was great. One of the key arguments that we'll see is that, immigrants in the North live these terrible, lived in these horrible conditions. Well, so do people in the South. And so this is one of the misunderstandings that we have about life in the North, life in the South, is kind of the difference, between what the lost cause myth and kind of what our perceptions are about the South and the way slaves lived versus the reality, right? And you often have, because particularly with the cotton economy and as cotton production expands, you do start to have slave quarters where you kind of have, a specific section, right? And that allows, for enslaved people, when they're in their own particular quarters, it allows for them to have their own relationships, their own systems. So you do have some kind of unique elements there. So there are ways you can kind of look at enslaved society versus, say, the enslaver society, and look at some of the differences. And I think 12 Years a Slave does a really good job of kind of depicting kind of what that was. So I'm hoping that by reading that book and thinking about it, that kind of helps you consider kind of how enslaved people lived. They do tend to form families by choice, and there is, thanks to the Second Great Awakening and reform movements, the expansion of Christianity. But I also think that it's important for you to recognize that just because they were enslaved does not mean that they just gave up and accepted the status, right? I've mentioned while we've been reading 12 Years a Slave, the issue of resistance. And we've seen running away, feigning illness, the breaking of tools. We'll see the kind of expansion of Underground Railroad as we move into the 1850s, and as there begins to be more concern about, people being captured and people trying to escape. And then you also have kind of this idea of two faces, right? And you definitely see this in 12 Years a Slave, where Northup as Platt presents one particular kind of version of himself when he's talking to Ford or Epps or anybody else. And then there's the version of him that he shows to other people, right? So it's kind of interesting to kind of understand how this kind of divided society in the South kind of plays out, right? And so we want to kind of understand that that's what's going on there. And then you have, kind of to remind you, we have abolition. So in this context of slavery, right, in this context of slavery expanding, as the country has more land, as early abolition has given way to kind of this radical abolition and this idea that we need to end slavery right away. Right. The frustration with the political system not being able to come up with an answer for this. And again, let me, remind you of that map we looked at that showed kind of the wealth that was concentrated in the South. Right. So is it any wonder the political system had trouble responding to this particular issue? And so what you have, early on, you have people like the Grimke sisters and Frederick Douglass trying to persuade people that they need to put an end to slavery. But what we'll see as we move into the 1850s is kind of this idea of direct action, right? So whether it is going to be, William Lloyd Garrison, whether it's going to be John Brown, we'll start to see more interest in kind of breaking down the slave system. We'll certainly start to see as in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War, this is going to be a hot button issue. And you start to have more awareness of what's happening in slave society, but there's still a debate, right? Because there is resistance to abolition. There are concerns about that. And in the South, you definitely have a defense of slavery. So one of the things we're going to be looking at next week is this idea of defending slavery, this idea that slavery, and you have several different arguments to defend it. One of them is that it was necessary for the economy. We can't do away with it. And you see this being, espoused by people that want to rely on gradual emancipation, that are concerned, well, if we suddenly free people, then what's going to happen in the cities? And there's going to be all this job competition and all these very extreme concerns, right? And this recognition that the economy is balanced on these different regions, right? And so how are we going to resolve that? And so that kind of slows down kind of addressing slavery. Those are the people that keep saying, wait, we'll get to it, right? And you definitely have some people that will come out and say, the northern economy is no better than the southern economy. They exploit people, they exploit immigrants, they exploit the working poor. They have a rigid social class system, and the people in the South will criticize the northern economy and social structure and argue that in the South, at least people don't have to worry about being homeless, right? Now, hopefully you figured out after reading 12 Years a Slave that, yeah, that's not that's not really a defense. But certainly that was kind of one of the ideas that gets thrown out there. You also start to have this idea of positive good, that enslaved people are children, they're not developed enough, that we have to take care of them, this very kind of paternalistic idea. You definitely see this with Master Ford, that it's God ordained, that God ordains for the status, right? And eventually you'll have increasing black codes, right? Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 will terrify a lot of Southerners. They'll kind of connect kind of the Second Great Awakening and Christianity with Nat Turner's rebellion, in part because Nat Turner, of course, is reading a Bible and he thinks he hears the voice of God. And so this will actually, after 1831, slavery will become more difficult. There'll be more restrictions against teaching people or teaching the enslaved how to read and that kind of thing. So this is kind of the context in which 12 Years a Slave is happening in a lot of ways. And so I wanted to just kind of point out these different kind of regional differences. I also wanted to show you there's a couple of political cartoons that are in American Yop. This one is an anti-Catholic that talks about kind of this concern about Catholic immigration, that they're bringing the Pope over here and they're going to permanently change the country. And this one right here, I think, is particularly dramatic. It's from a little bit later, towards 1860, but it shows you the contrast between the Irish immigration in the East and the Chinese immigration in the West. And kind of the impact that they're going to devour the American culture and that ultimately they're going to turn into something that nobody can recognize. So I just thought that I'd point out these two. They're both in the American Yop Reader, and those are some really good cartoons. I don't know. I can't remember. I think there's a couple in the textbook as well. But that should kind of give you an idea. Again, keep in mind that you have different regions developing. You have this market economy that was based on this idea of interdependence. But having interdependence and coming up with a political solution for something as complicated and as well, I say complicated. It's not necessarily complicated, but something as intertwined with prosperity as slavery, it becomes a really hot button issue. So you want to kind of keep these regional differences in mind as we move forward, as we start talking about manifest destiny and the expansion of land. Like I said, next week we'll be looking at the defense of slavery and talking about how slave society, or how the South and the North kind of viewed this question of slavery and how it all worked together.